It's a pleasure for me to be able to bring God's Word this morning to you. We're carrying on in our series in the book of James. There's a Yiddish saying, man tak und Gott lach. That's the only time I've ever used Yiddish in a sermon before. And what that means is a man plans and God laughs. So our sermon title today is, People Plan and God Laughs. And when we think about our experience over the past few years, what has that been like for you? Every time we thought about reopening or doing something special here at Grace Chapel, there would be another mandate, another kind of directive from the government, and we weren't able to proceed out of safety and out of kind of making good sense. Maybe some of you could think about your own life, about how you've had a kind of a clear plan. This is what I'm going to do. We just sang this song, and I will build my life upon your love. It is a firm foundation. But sometimes we build our lives on other plans, other aspirations, other thoughts about what we want to do. And perhaps this image that comes up on the screen, you can relate to it, right? This is your plan. You have this goal that you want to get to. Let's bring it up here, Phil. Next one, back to the image. There we go, my plan. Nice straight line. It's just going to be like this. I'm going to set off on this course in life, and I'm going to achieve this goal at the end of the day. But in reality, it looks a little bit more like the other plan, right? There's pitfalls and challenges and heartaches and difficulties, things that you wouldn't have anticipated all of a sudden become obstacles and challenges. But as it says on this thing, sometimes God doesn't do things the way we think he should. But God has a perfect plan for your life. Last week, Pelham did a sermon on wisdom, on how we are to relate to each other. And today's passage that we're looking at is only 5 verses long, and it's a passage on how to be wise in the way we relate to God, God's self. I really appreciated a quote that Pelham came up with from Henry Nouwen last week, and it's going to come up on the screen. Henry Nouwen writes, "To pray is to walk in the full light of God, and to say simply without holding back, 'I am human and you are God.' At that moment, conversion occurs, the restoration of the true relationship. A human being is not someone who once in a while makes a mistake, and God is not someone who now and then forgives. No, human beings are sinners, and God is love." There's a lot in this quote that we could unpack this morning, and perhaps it shows up on your outline, and you could take it home with you and think about it. This quote is in strict, I would say, contrast to one of the famous songs that Frank Sinatra used to sing, written by a Canadian, Paul Anka. Frank Sinatra used to sing, "Regrets, I've had a few, but then again too few to mention. I did what I had to do. I saw it through without exemption. I planned each chartered course, each careful step along the byway, and more, much more than this. For what is a man, what has he got? If not himself, then he has not to say the things he truly feels, and not the words of someone who kneels. Let the record shows, I took all the blows, and I did it." Exactly what God doesn't want of us, right? And when James writes this passage that we're looking at, these 5 verses from James 4, he's giving us some wisdom on how we are to conduct, how we are to live our lives that will be a source of blessing for us and the communities in which we live. So this passage is going to come up right now, and I'm going to say, let's read it together, starting with from Now Listen. Now listen, you who say, "Today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why, you do not know even what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, 'If it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that.' As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. Well, I think we have a lot that we could unpack about these 5 verses this morning. I always appreciate the way James writes in a kind of a bold way, a challenging way to the people that he's writing to. It's hard to ignore some of the things that he is saying here. And I have just a few kind of observations from this text that I wanted to share with you. First of all is this one. Embrace our complete dependence on God. Instead of like Frank Sinatra and Paul Anka and say, I've done it my way, go the absolute 180 degrees opposite direction and embrace our complete dependence upon God. I really appreciated earlier on in James 4 verse 6 and James 4 verse 10. But he gives us more grace. That's why Scripture says, God opposes the proud but gives favor to the humble. Or in verse 10, humble yourselves before the Lord and he will lift you up. So when James writes these words to people who are making plans for their lives, he's saying, you have no idea at all what will happen. These are probably businessmen who have all sorts of ideas about how they're going to go and invest and develop their company and make some great profit. Now listen, today or tomorrow we'll go to this city or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. He's saying, you don't understand it at all. And it's really important for all of us to keep this perspective in life, that anything that we have, any strength that we have today is because it's a gift of God. I remember being in a as Pelham talks about, Bible study groups in churches or in high schools. I remember being in this Bible study group with a young Jamaican man who prayed. And his prayer was this: Lord, thank you for waking me up this morning and putting me in my right mind. I thought that's a very accurate prayer that we should be praying regularly. This morning, my alarm went off at 7:15. I was up already. But I went back to sleep, and when I woke up at 8:50, it was time to get moving, right? and I'm so thankful that when I got out of bed and I'm able to move, I say, Lord, thank you for this. Every moment that we have is an incredible gift that God has given to us. Look at Proverbs 27, verse 1 in the Message. Don't brashly announce what you're going to go to do tomorrow. You don't know the first thing about tomorrow. And I would say that's merciful sometimes, right? I don't know what's going to take place in your life this week or in my life this week, but I know that God is present with me. I know God is present with you. And whatever it is, whether it's good news or bad, wonderful things to celebrate like a graduation or a loss in the family, God is there and God is caring for us. Why, you don't even know what will happen, James says in verse 14. And then he says these words, what is your life? Good for us to stop and think about it. What is the thing that I'm trying to achieve and gather in my life today? What sort of outcome am I looking for? Embrace our complete dependence on God. And the second point I get from this passage is this: appreciate the fragility and great gift of life. Appreciate the fragility and great gift of life. He goes on in verse 14, you are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. If I just close the service off now, that'd be kind of discouraging, right? Like, wow, there you're done, right? Last September, when we went out to British Columbia for the birth of our first grandchild. When Levi was born, his life and the life of his mom, Alex, was held on a thread. And I'm so thankful for the intervention of the medical staff in that hospital and the great care of our God that this child is now like over 11 months old and the mother is doing fine. But our lives are like that. Here for a moment and gone just like that. And in terms of eternity, when we think about how what our lives is like, it's less than a snap, our life here and now. Whether you're in your 90s or you're 15 years old, it's nothing. but it's a gift. It's a beautiful, incredible, amazing gift that God wakes us up, puts us in our right mind this morning, and gives us the opportunity to interact with each other, to be a blessing in the community, to do something that is positive and helpful. The psalmist writes in Psalm 90, verse 12, "Teach us to realize the brevity of life so that we may grow in wisdom." Teach us to realize the brevity of life so that we may grow in wisdom. Back over a year and a half ago, I was invited to a meeting with a group of urologists and radiation oncologists. And we were talking about how people are treated who have prostate cancer here in Nova Scotia. And I said to them, there's nothing like a cancer diagnosis that helps sharpen your focus in life, right? When you get the news that you have a cancer of some sort, before, hey, I used to visit people in the hospital. I wasn't one of those people who stay in the hospital. And Paul, thank you for being there on my surgery day that you came and showed up, and JB as well, and Morris and people who supported me. But it's like the brevity of life, how quickly, and the fragility of it, how quickly it can go. What is your life? What are you trying to achieve? What are the things that you want to kind of leave as a legacy after your time here on earth? When God gives you the stewardship of something for a short period of time, how do you want to leave it afterwards? There's a story that's told in the Gospels, and thank you for the reading of the Gospel earlier on in the service. We're told this story about a couple of brothers, and it's a money issue. Anybody who's done wills and inheritances knows what it's like. Families can get kind of tense over this. And someone comes up to Jesus and he says, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Give me the money, give me something from the estate of my parents." And Jesus says, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, look at this verse in verse 15 of Luke 12, verse 15. Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." So James is writing to a group of people who have big plans for this coming year. We're going to go to this town and this city and invest and make profits and gather things. And he's saying, actually, there's a more important thing in your life, and that's your relationship with God. In this story that Jesus shares with this guy who's asking for money from his brother, he tells this great story. Look at verses Luke 12, 18 to 21. Then he said, "This is what I'll do." He talks about this man who's just had a bumper crop, this rich man who had a yielded abundant harvest, and he thought to himself, "What shall I do? I'll have to place my crops in storage." And isn't it incredible in North America and in Canada here that there's storage centers that are popping up all over the place? So the houses that we live in aren't big enough for us to hold our stuff. And so we buy more stuff, and then we pay someone to look after our stuff in some garage. And I have a friend, he's a great guy, but I think he owns 3 storage units around the world with his stuff. And what's the point of that? What are we going to gather? Well, I can understand for a few months when you're transitioning maybe from one place to another, but to pay for stuff over and above what it's worth, it simply doesn't make sense. Jesus says in the story in Luke 12, 18 and following, then he says, "This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I'll store my surplus gain, and I'll say to myself, you have plenty of gain laid up for years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God." Appreciate the fragility and great gift of life and make the most with it, not just simply more stuff. In this passage that James writes, he says in verse 15, instead of making and announcing all these great plans, he says, "Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that." Genuinely seek God's direction. So in this life, in this time that we have, we need to ask ourselves, Lord, what do you want me to do with my life? and really, truly be open to doing whatever the Lord might want to give to you. I love these verses in Romans 12, where the Apostle Paul writes to the Romans, first two verses of Romans 12. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. What does God want you to do with your life? How has God put you together in the circumstances that you're going through at the present time, and how does he want you to use that for his glory? You know, a lot of people remember in university days, Lord, what do you want me to do? What profession should I choose? What should I study? Whom should I marry? And so on. All these big choices. But the choices keep getting complicated, right? The choices keep presenting themselves to us all the time, and we need to say, Lord, what do you want me to do today? Again, I appreciate Eugene Peterson's translation of Romans 12, 1 and 2. So here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what he wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings the best out of you, develops well-formed maturity in you. The Lord wants to do a work in your life. The Lord wants to use you to make an impact right here in Halifax, right here in your neighborhood, wherever you may live. And it has to come from this idea. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. Does anybody know what inshallah means? If God's willing, right? God willing, Dio volante. Lord, what do you want me to do in my life? Ask it and see what the Lord opens up for you. This passage teaches to embrace our complete dependence on God, to appreciate the fragility and great gift of life, and to encourages us to genuinely seek God's direction. And I would say to you, when you wake up tomorrow morning, before you put your feet on the floor, you say, Lord, what do you want me to accomplish today? And ask for spiritual eyes to be open to what the opportunities may be there for you. The Lord's going to open up wonderful things for you to do. Gives you great opportunities to speak for him, to bless somebody for him, to care for the people around you for him. In verse 16, James writes, as it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. And this is how simple and basic and direct James gets here. All such boasting is evil. Then in verse 17, if anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it's sin for them. Let me read that again. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. And this brings me to the last point of this message. Seize the opportunities that God gives to you. What's God's will for your life? Well, it's when you walk out the door and you see an opportunity to care for someone, to step into that situation. I'm so excited. Today is Sunday suppers, the day that we are responsible for bringing meals down to St. Andrew's United Church, and we provide for the needy of Halifax. And JB has been encouraging me more, saying, how can we get even more involved as a community in that ministry? Pelham and our young people are coming down to serve this afternoon and help assemble all the meals. A family that's relatively new to Grace Chapel has started going now to help provide the meal with their 9-year-old child, working it together. Seize the opportunity that the Lord opens up right in front of you. In John 4, verse 34, Jesus says to his disciples, then Jesus explained, my nourishment comes from doing the will of God who sent me and from finishing his work. The nourishment, the joy, the kind of the strengthening that Jesus gets was by doing the things that God had given him to do. Here's another tremendous quote from Eugene Peterson. We not only let God be God as he really is, but we start doing the things for which he made us. We take a certain route. We follow certain directions. We do specific things. There are ethical standards to follow. There are moral values to foster. There are spiritual disciplines to practice. There is societal justice to pursue. There are personal relationships to develop. None of this is difficult to understand. So what the Lord calls you to do might be different from what the Lord calls me to do. But I think you know what it is. You know who the person is at your workplace that you need to share the love of Christ with. You know the neighbor that you get to interact with at the grocery store who may need help packing her car. You may know the situation that's happening in the life of another person that you might simply have something that you could take that's been in storage too long and give it away for kingdom purposes. It's simple. It's obvious. It's exciting. I'm going to finish off this sermon with a quote from Jim Elliot. Jim Elliot was a guy who grew up in a church very similar to Grace Chapel, and as a young man, he went on to Wheaton College in Chicago, and he went to Ecuador to share Jesus with the people, some tribal people down in Ecuador. And at 29 years old, before I was born, this man's life was taken. He was killed. But his writings were incredibly strong. He married Elizabeth Elliot, an author who, if you ever heard Elizabeth Elliot speak, you had a sense of God speaking through her to people. And she had a great short marriage with him, and she lost him, but she produced his journals. And he says these words: "He, a man, a person, is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." And what is it that we tend to hold on to that fills our hands in such a way that we can't open them and receive the blessings of God? Amen.